Thank you for joining today's educational webinar with Cancer Support Community, Los Angeles. I'm Abby Espinoza, the Program Manager at CSCLA, and I'm honored to welcome you to this week's webinar titled The Importance of Clinical Trials in Oncology. Before we begin, if this is your first time joining us, Cancer Support Community, Los Angeles is a premier nonprofit organization providing vital social and emotional support to families facing cancer, including patients, caregivers, and their loved ones, all at no cost. Our programs include support groups, healthy lifestyle classes, social activities, and educational programs such as this one. If you would like to learn more about our services or watch past webinars, please visit our website at cancersupportla.org. Before I introduce today's speaker, please note that your video and microphone are automatically disabled for this webinar. Please enter questions for the speaker into the Q&A feature found at the bottom of the Zoom window. Questions will be answered at the end of the presentation. We may not be able to get to all of your questions today, but we will get to as many as possible. Please use the chat feature to share comments and resources with other participants or to ask questions of CSCLA. We ask you to limit chat comments to information relevant to this topic. Dr. Luca Valle is an assistant professor in the Department of Radiation Oncology at the Geffen School of Medicine at UCLA. He is also a staff physician at the Greater Los Angeles Veterans Affairs Healthcare System. Dr. Valle graduated summa cum laude from Occidental College in 2010 with a Bachelor of Arts degree in biology. He then went on to earn his medical degree from Dartmouth Medical School, where he was awarded the Marsh Tenney Research Award for his contributions to cancer research. During medical school, he also had the opportunity to participate in a research fellowship at the National Institute of Health, where he gained valuable experience in clinical and translational research methods in oncology. It gives me great pleasure to welcome today's speaker, Dr. Luca Valle.
Thank you so much for that very comprehensive introduction, and I'm so happy to be here. Thanks, Abby, for the invite to be back at CSCLA and to be talking with you all today about clinical trials, which is a topic very near and dear to my heart. I'm going to share my screen. Can everyone see the slide?
Yes, we can see them.
Perfect. All right. So I modified the title ever so slightly. I wanted to really focus on sort of the path that not only investigators take for sort of creating clinical trials, but also the path that patients take as they go through clinical trials. And we're here to talk about what clinical trials are in plain language, why they matter, why they're important, what participation really looks like. And as part of that discussion, I'll also focus a little bit on some of the most practice-changing clinical trials that have been published recently. So you have a sense of sort of what questions are being asked and how they're being asked and how different interventions make their way into the cancer treatments available to patients. We'll also talk about strategies for accessing clinical trials, as well as sort of what happens after a clinical trial has been published and how treatments ultimately make it into the hands of patients. So I do want to leave some time at the end for questions. I'm hoping that the presentation itself will take around half an hour or so that we do have ample time for discussion at the end of the hour. I was going to give a little bit of an introduction about myself, but Abby pretty much covered that. I'm an oncologist, a radiation oncologist in particular. I focus on the treatment of genitourinary cancers, which are cancers involving most of the prostate, but also the bladder, the kidney, the testes. And I work at UCLA part of the time, and then at the Greater Los Angeles VA for the other part of the time. I'm really passionate about clinical trials. I think clinical trials are really how we move treatments forward. It's the engine that drives advances forward in cancer care. But I know that they can be complex and hard to understand particularly if you're not the patient who's going through it. It seems rather theoretical. And so I'm hoping that after this webinar, everyone will have a bit more of a solid sense of what clinical trials are and how important they are. So the objectives for today's webinar are to talk about what types of clinical trials exist, how clinical trials are organized, how clinical trials bring new and more effective cancer treatments to patients, and what participation in a clinical trial might actually look like from the patient's point of view. We'll talk about a few examples of some high-profile clinical trials that have led us to the modern treatments that we have accessible to our patients today. And we'll talk about how treatments move from clinical trials to standard of care. And we'll finish by capping off with a discussion of how to find and enroll in clinical trials, whether it's you yourself, the patient, or if you're a family member advocating for one of your family members that has cancer. There are a number of resources that you have at your disposal to find clinical trials relevant for your specific disease site. So introduction to clinical trials, and I apologize if some of this seems basic or repetitive. I just want to make sure that everyone's sort of on the same page in terms of what we're talking about when we're talking about clinical trials. And at its most fundamental level, a clinical trial is a research study that tests new ways to prevent, find, or treat cancer. It's important to note that clinical trials don't exist solely to test new cancer drugs, which is often what most people think of when they think about a clinical trial. Most people will kind of picture in their mind, half of the patients get the standard treatment, whereas the other half get a new treatment, a new drug, and then investigators compare the effect of the cancer treatment response between those two groups of patients. And oftentimes that is what clinical designs look like, but that's not always the case, and it doesn't need to always be that way. Sometimes clinical trials don't even evaluate drugs at all, and instead they might evaluate like a strategy to prevent cancer, for example. One such study could be, a study that is testing cardiovascular interventions, like running on a treadmill for 5 hours each week or something like that, and looking to see the impact that that has on, preventing prostate cancer or the incidence of prostate cancer. So half of the people in that study might be required to participate in vigorous cardiovascular exercise, 5 hours on a treadmill, whereas the other half of the patients in that theoretical study would be prohibited from doing so. And the rates of prostate cancer, for example, would be compared in those two groups many years down the road. And then you would have your answer as to whether or not exercise improved the incidence and aggressiveness of prostate cancer. So take home here is that it doesn't necessarily have to be a drug that's tested. Sometimes it could be an intervention that's tested. Another thing that clinical trials can sometimes be evaluating is new ways to detect cancer. Obviously, the sooner we can detect cancer, the more likely we are to be able to cure it. And so rather than evaluating drugs or interventions, sometimes we're looking at screening tests like blood tests or CAT scans, for example. So if we're trying to prevent aggressive lung cancer that kills patients, we might design a study that takes half of the patients and exposes them to a chest CT scan. And then the other half of the patients would not be exposed to that chest CT scan. And then they would compare the death rates from lung cancer in both of those arms to see if screening for lung cancer via chest CT scans helps us better identify cancer earlier on. And then in my field, where I see a lot of prostate cancer, there have been a number of clinical trials that looked at whether PSA blood test screening. PSA is a protein that circulates in the blood, and it's also created by prostate cancer. So can earlier screening of PSA with a blood test help us pick up cancer sooner and intervene sooner so that fewer men are dying from prostate cancer? All of those are examples of screening clinical trials where, again, we're not testing a cancer treatment, we're testing a screening intervention to see if it reduces mortality. And then, moving back to treatment interventions, it's not all about drugs. There's also many other treatments that exist to treat cancer that are not necessarily medications. So there can be hard-hitting non-drug interventions like surgery or radiotherapy, or it could be things like psychosocial interventions like relaxation, mindfulness. Some studies have even looked at doing non-curative treatment approaches, focusing on palliative care, patient comfort, and seeing how that affects survival. We'll talk about one of those studies a little bit later on in the webinar. But there's many different things that a clinical trial can assess. And sometimes we're surprised to learn from clinical trials that doing less is actually more impactful than doing more. It's important to note that most of all of the diagnostic tools that we have at our disposal for cancer today came from clinical trials. All major treatments like immunotherapies or chemotherapies or radiotherapy that you hear about in the news were all once studied in clinical trials. And lastly, clinical trials are essential for moving cancer treatments forward, both for discovering treatments that are more effective and less toxic, and also leading us closer to being able to cure cancer. All clinical trials involve people. We can't test these interventions without the volunteer efforts of people who decide to participate in clinical trials. And so we really depend on patients and their families and their support systems to help us ask these important questions and move treatments forward. So what is a cancer clinical trial? The other thing to note here is that cancer trials are part of routine care for cancer at all stages. Some people think that clinical trials are only available at the end stage when there's very few other treatment options available. But that's a common misconception. That's not necessarily true. There's several clinical trials that are testing interventions at all stages of cancer. A clinical trial is not just an intervention of last resort. We are often looking much earlier in the disease trajectory, even before patients have been diagnosed with cancer, to see if there's interventions that can either reduce the incidence of cancer or treat cancer at earlier stages before it becomes more aggressive and spreads. Many people in trials receive a standard treatment plus or minus something new. We're always trying to build off of what we know and build off of what works. And so oftentimes clinical trials these days involve different combinations of treatments. We know treatment X works well, we know treatment Y works well, but if we combine them, will it work even better? That's a common clinical trial design that we see. And then I would add that, another way to sort of conceptualize clinical trials, it's a unique way to sort of empower yourself to be involved in the discovery of new cures. By participating in a clinical trial, your unique biology, your unique sort of personhood, humanity is helping us answer the question of whether or not treatments work or do not. So having your biology represented in the clinical trials is helpful and helps us sort of represent you and your community in sort of the understanding of how well new treatments work, because new treatments don't work for everybody. And so the more people we have from different backgrounds who are represented in clinical trials, the better sense we'll have as to which populations these new treatments work well in and which populations they don't work well in. So who can join a clinical trial? Well, in theory, anybody could join a clinical trial, but each clinical trial has very specific guidelines and eligibility criteria for patients. And so specific criteria might include cancer types, right? Some clinical trials are only looking at interventions in patients who have been diagnosed with a certain type of cancer, like prostate cancer or breast cancer or ovarian cancer. Other trials don't really care what type of cancer that you have. They might just be looking at advanced cancers of all different types. Sometimes there's some cancers that are, some clinical trials that are looking at specific interventions that can only be performed if you have or have not received certain treatments in the past. And then another very common eligibility criteria that's looked at is overall patient health. We want to make sure that patients are healthy enough both to receive either the experimental new treatment or the old or standard treatment. And so patients' overall health is a factor that enters into whether or not a clinical trial is appropriate for a given patient. I'd like to emphasize here that just because you don't qualify for a clinical trial, if you get the news that the clinical trial isn't right for you, it doesn't mean that you failed or that there's something wrong with you or your disease. It just means that that particular clinical trial isn't the right fit for you, and there likely is another trial out there that might be a better fit. The reason why we have all of these rules and these criteria and restrictions on who can and cannot participate in clinical trials, it's really to help us protect the safety of the patients who are enrolling in the study, number one. That's first and foremost, the most important thing. But it's also to help us ensure that we have accurate results that we can interpret and apply in specific clinical settings, right? We want to know if a treatment works well in the specific context X, Y, or Z, which is why we might limit the inclusion criteria to specifically include context X, Y, or Z. I will say here as well that there are external safety boards, often comprised of physicians, patients, and scientists that are sort of removed from the clinical setting. And their role is to review the eligibility criteria to make sure that patients meet the eligibility criteria before they enroll in the clinical trial. These safety boards are also frequently monitoring the effects of the clinical trial for safety. And if there's any issues that come up, they're the first to know, and they can potentially cause a pause in the clinical trial or direct patients to continue to enroll if the results look promising. So clinical trials are very highly regulated, precisely run endeavors because we really put patient safety at the forefront of everything that we're doing in clinical trials. These safety boards, these checks and balances are not only to keep patients safe, but they're also to ensure that society has confidence in clinical trials and that we always have the patient's best interests at the forefront of our priority list. So what does it actually look like to participate in a clinical trial? Well, the very first thing, if you're found to be eligible for participation in a clinical trial, which is very exciting, the first thing you'll do is sign a consent document. This is signed by both the patient and their physician. The physician would have to be a member of the clinical trial study team, which means that they're trained in the interventions that the patient will be receiving on the clinical trial. They know the clinical trial protocol, they know the follow-up period, they know everything that needs to be done in order to ensure the patient receives the correct treatment on the clinical trial. So that physician and the patient both sign this document, which essentially acknowledges that some aspect of the care that they're receiving is new or experimental, and that there may be, unknown side effects associated with that. So this sort of acknowledgement by both the physician and their patient that some part of the care is new or experimental is really important before a patient can receive any of the treatments specified by the clinical trial. As part of the process of signing the consent, the physician will review the potential risks and the potential benefits of participating in the clinical trial with the patient. At that point, patients will have a chance to ask any questions they might have, and they can take as much time as needed to decide whether or not they would like to move forward with participating in the clinical trial. Consent to participate in the clinical trial is completely voluntary. Nobody should ever be forcing patients to participate in clinical trials. And it's worth emphasizing as well that patients can stop participating in a clinical trial at any time. Just because you start the study does not mean you need to complete the study. Patients have the freedom to stop a clinical trial, remove themselves from the intervention, remove themselves from follow-up at any point in the process with no consequences to them. Nobody is going to be pressuring patients into remaining on the clinical trial if they don't want to. And so some examples of risks and benefits that might be discussed with a patient who's considering a clinical trial. The benefit would be an access to new, potentially better cancer treatments. That's sort of the whole allure of clinical trials really for the patient, is that they may be getting a treatment that's more likely to cure their cancer or do so in a way that has fewer side effects or that's more convenient for the patient. So that's probably the most important potential benefit of participating in a clinical trial. There's also extra monitoring and support to all patients who are enrolled in clinical trials. Like I mentioned previously, there's a lot of regulatory bodies keeping tabs on what's going on during clinical trials. And so there's a lot more support and monitoring going on to make sure that patients are being treated appropriately and safely and consistent with the clinical trial protocol. Risks. So oftentimes when new treatments, new drugs are being used, the side effects of these drugs may not be fully understood. And so there's always a risk of unknown side effects that could come up when patients are participating in clinical trials. And then lastly, the results may be uncertain, right? We think that this particular treatment that's being tested is going to improve cure rates for patients, but it may not. It may actually, decrease cure rates, although that's less likely, or it could have no impact whatsoever on cure rates. So the fact that we don't know can make some patients anxious, and some patients are just more comfortable moving forward with the treatment with sort of a known cure rate and a known side effect profile. The care on a clinical trial does follow a very strict regimen known as a protocol. And shown in this image, you can see an example of what sort of a timeline for a protocol might look like. So each protocol usually specifies the treatment schedule, when treatments are being administered, how often, etc. The follow-up schedule after the treatments have been administered is usually spelled out in the protocol as well. We don't just treat patients and then sort of let them go off and sort of not follow up. We want to be following up with patients so that we know exactly what the impacts of that treatment intervention were, whether it worked, whether it didn't, how it affected their quality of life, and what the side effects are. If there's any blood draws or scans or any other interventions that are required in order to monitor the effectiveness of the intervention, those will also be spelled out in the protocol. And lastly, if patients need to fill out any questionnaires or quality of life survey instruments, those will also be spelled out in the protocol. This is actually something that we're seeing more and more of. In the old days, physicians used to be the ones that scored the side effects from certain treatment interventions, and the patients would grade it on a scale of 1 to 5, 1 being not so severe, 5 being very severe. And while physicians still do score toxicity, there's been a shift where most of the side effects that are scored and evaluated are actually reported by patients themselves. And you can imagine how much more powerful that is if a patient themselves was telling us, gosh, I had this side effect and it was, this level of severity for me. That's far more meaningful than having a physician grade the side effects and the severity thereof. So we're seeing more and more of quality of life instruments being driven by patients and completed by patients. So that's a very important component of modern clinical trials. So how do you decide if a clinical trial is right for you? Well, the most important thing to do is talk about that specific clinical trial with your healthcare team. In that discussion, you want to bring up your specific goals, right? Do you want to be aggressive with your treatment? Do you want to be less aggressive and focus on quality of life versus quality of life? What are your goals with the treatment? Do you want the standard treatment that's tried and true, that has a very known side effect and cure profile? Or do you want to go for something a little bit different, something new, or something that might improve cure rates? Also important to consider the time commitment that each treatment might require. So oftentimes, because we're really trying to understand every aspect of how the trial intervention is affecting a patient, there might be more of a patient time commitment involved in participation in a clinical trial, because we want patients to fill out those questionnaires. We want them to tell us how they're being affected by the treatment. Questionnaires that would not be required if patients are receiving the standard treatment. So sometimes clinical trials involve a little bit more time from the patient, both to complete questionnaires and to get extra blood draws and scans that might be needed to make sure the treatment's working. Regardless of whether you're doing the clinical trial or the standard treatment, you want to be aware that you may need family support to get you through the intervention. It's always good to have that. It's always good to discuss your goals with your family as well. And then lastly, costs. Most of the time, clinical trials are designed in such a way to where participating in the clinical trial will not add any costs to the patient. In some cases, there are increased costs to the patient associated with participating in a clinical trial, although that's not as common. And in some cases, the costs are actually lower because whoever is funding the clinical trial is paying for receipt of the treatment. And so the patient is not paying for the treatment, their insurance is not paying for the treatment. The treatment is often covered entirely by the study sponsor. So sometimes the cost matters, sometimes it doesn't. Just another thing to think about if you're deciding whether or not a clinical trial is right for you. So how are clinical trials organized? There's many different ways to organize a clinical trial. I think many of us have heard of these phases: phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, phase 4. And so starting at the top, phase 1 tends to be smaller clinical trials, where the goal here is just to find out if a drug or an intervention is safe. We're also trying to figure out what the maximum safe dose is. And so really, phase 1 trials are all about safety. This is a completely new agent, a new drug. We want to know how safe it is in humans and what the maximum safely tolerated dose is. Because there's a little bit more risk involved in phase 1 trials, they tend to be smaller in number. Fewer patients are involved in phase 1 studies compared to the other phases. So let's say that you do in fact find that this new drug is safe, and you find out what a safe dose is to be administered in humans. At that point, phase 2 trials come in to test that same agent, that same drug, to see how well it works in a specific cancer. So phase 2 studies are all about efficacy. How well does this new agent work to treat a given cancer? And then let's assume that the phase 2 studies show, yeah, actually, it is effective and patients do respond well and tumors shrink. The next step would be to take that drug into a phase 3 study. So phase 3 studies are where this new drug, this new intervention would be compared head-to-head to the standard treatment. So the best standard treatment is compared to the new intervention, the new drug. These are much larger clinical trials. They're often randomized as well. We'll talk about what that means. And really the goal of these studies is to show that Either the new treatment is non-inferior to the standard treatment, or it's better than the standard treatment. And then finally, phase 4 clinical trials are conducted after interventions have been approved and many thousands of patients have received the interventions. Phase 4 studies are almost like a look back at those patients and how they do in the long term, looking at safety, looking at side effects, looking at efficacy, long after drugs have been approved and many patients have received them, kind of looking at the long-term time horizon as to how well these interventions worked. Another note on how clinical trials can be organized: they can be single-arm studies where all patients get the same treatment. There's no randomization, there's no coin flip, there's no uncertainty about what treatment you're going to get. On a single-arm study, all patients get the same treatment, and generally, these are reserved for phase 1 or phase 2 trials. Then you could have 2-arm trials. This is more commonly what you see in the phase 3 setting, but sometimes in phase 2 studies as well. This is where there's 2 different arms. Half of the patients get treatment with one intervention on one arm, whereas the other half get treatments with a separate intervention on a separate arm. Oftentimes, these 2-arm studies can be randomized, meaning that it's either a coin flip or more likely a computer algorithm that randomly assigns a patient to one treatment or the other. But that's not always the case. Sometimes there's other factors about the patient or about their disease that will determine which treatment they get. But randomization is the purest way to ensure that there's no biases entering into your study question. So if there's nothing but random chance that assigns which patient is getting which intervention, then you truly know that that intervention or the observed effect of that intervention is going to be from the treatment that's assigned rather than other factors. And then you've got these other forms of clinical trials. There's a registry or observational trial. These are for lower risk interventions where, they're quite safe actually, but they might be new. They may not have had as many years of follow-up or experience with them. And so we enroll patients on these studies or these clinical trials when we want to get more information about how they're doing with these newer interventions, even though they're quite safe. So there's less monitoring involved with these types of observational or registry studies because they're considered to be a little bit safer. And then there's crossover clinical trials where in some trial designs, patients might be randomized to receive one treatment or the other, but at some point, if their disease stops responding, they're allowed to cross over to the other study intervention and receive that treatment instead. So there's many different ways studies can be conducted. They can also be blinded. So participants, patients might not know exactly which of the 2 treatments they're receiving. That's referred to as a blinded or a masked clinical trial. It's single masked or single blinded if the patients themselves don't know which intervention, don't know which drug they're receiving. It's double blinded if both the patients and their physicians are masked to whatever treatment they're receiving. Again, the whole purpose of masking is to remove potential biases in measuring the outcomes of the clinical trial. And then another strategy to remove bias in clinical trials is to use placebos. So for the patients who are not getting the experimental intervention, they might get a placebo that is a pill or an injection or some treatment that looks very similar to the experimental intervention, but in fact has no effect. So it might be a sugar tablet or an injection of just water or saline in order to sort of remove the potential bias that patients have when they think that they're receiving an experimental treatment. They might be biased to think that, oh, my outcomes are going to be better, and that in turn can affect how they view their treatment and the actual outcomes of the treatment. So it's very important to remove as much bias as we can in the clinical trial process. And clinical trials can be very small. They can be conducted as a single institution, like UCLA or Cedars-Sinai or the VA, or multiple institutions can pool their resources together to enroll patients across the country. This can be done domestically, it can be done internationally, and that way, different providers with different practice styles can all participate in the trial, even though they're all performing the same protocol on patients. It's a way to get more variability in sort of more nuanced practice flavors or practice styles to make sure that the trial is more generalizable. If it's conducted at multiple institutions, it's more generalizable than if it's conducted at just one institution. And then you've got large cooperative group trials. Those are conducted with thousands and thousands of patients. These are the largest, often most reliable clinical trials that are run. And it involves members of the cooperative group. These members can be from all over the globe that see patients and are sort of committed to discussing these cooperative group trials with their patients. Trials can be funded by different sources. There can be industry-funded trials where a medical device company or a pharmaceutical company is funding the clinical trial. Obviously, they're incentivized to show that the clinical trial is positive or that their device or their drug is beneficial to patients. And so whenever industry is funding clinical trials, there's always safeguards in place, for example, to ensure that nobody from the company can perform the analysis. Nobody from the company can be involved in the statistical design, and nobody from the company can be involved in the ultimate publication, writing of the paper, and presenting the paper at scientific conferences. Sometimes hospitals or clinical departments can use the revenue that they generate from seeing patients to fund their own clinical trials. Sometimes private donors can fund clinical trials in disease types or disease spaces that they find to be important. And lastly, us as taxpayers all contribute to clinical trial funding as well. So our taxpayer dollars go to the Department of Health and Human Services, which in turn goes to NIH. And then from there, the NIH allocates taxpayer dollars to pay for these large cooperative clinical trial networks that I was telling you about previously. So I wanted to briefly touch on some examples of some practice-changing clinical trials, just so that you have a sense of what questions are being asked, how they're being asked, and some real-life examples of ways that clinical trials have improved care for patients. Before we touch on that, I just wanted to let you know where people can access the results and the findings and the research that is reported out from clinical trials. The first place I would start is, large reputable academic journals. There's just a few examples I'm showing here. JAMA, the New England Journal of Medicine, the American Cancer Society puts out good journals, the Journal of Clinical Oncology, very well regarded in oncology, and the Lancet as well. Some of the best, most impactful clinical trial results are reported in these journals, and they have really great resources on their website for patients and providers who are looking to learn more about the latest and greatest findings in medicine. But you can also search PubMed, which is a resource available to everybody, for the scientific literature related to any question you're interested in. So a lot of the clinical trials that are reported in these journals, they're all indexed in PubMed, which is sort of a large central resource for where you can access the results of clinical trials that you may have participated in the past or that family members may have participated in. PubMed can be sort of your one-stop shop. All right, so this is an example of a clinical trial published in the New England Journal of Medicine in order to treat a condition that cancer patients often experience called cachexia. Cachexia is where different circulating proteins in your body that are stimulated by cancer, those can cause cancer patients to lose a considerable amount of weight, to be nutritionally depleted, to lose muscle mass, and that weakness and low energy also in turn has this negative impact where it makes it harder for patients to tolerate the cancer treatments that they need in order to keep the cancer at bay. So cancer-related weight loss, or cachexia, is a problem, and these investigators wanted to see if a new drug might be able to reverse some of this cancer-related cachexia. So the intervention they looked at was an injection of a new medicine called ponsegromab. Half of the patients got that injection. The other half of the patients got a control injection, a placebo injection of just water. And they measured the outcome of change in body weight at 12 weeks. And what they found was that in patients who got the placebo, the water injection, essentially those patients lost weight, which is why you're seeing this gray bar moving down into the negatives, because these patients who did not get the drug continued to lose weight. Whereas the patients who did get the study drug are shown in these blue bars here, and you can see that as the dose of the drug increased, patients gained more and more weight. So even though this drug is not FDA approved yet, it's promising, and it's going to advance to phase 3 studies. And it's sort of in this way that we advance different drugs or different agents through the clinical trial pipeline. They have to demonstrate that they work in the phase 2 setting before moving on to the phase 3 setting. Another example near and dear to my heart as a genitourinary radiation oncologist is this study, which was published last year in the New England Journal of Medicine. This was a clinical trial that evaluated 2 different radiotherapy programs. So their population of patients was patients with localized prostate cancer, and they compared the standard radiotherapy regimen for localized prostate cancer, which is small doses per day delivered over 20 to 39 sessions. That was the standard treatment, and that was being compared to this new treatment, which is where the dose of radiation is increased and the number of sessions is reduced to just 5 sessions delivered every other day. That treatment is known as SBRT. The older, more conventional treatment is known as IMRT. So they compared patients who got each of those 2 treatments, and they were looking at cancer recurrence rates. What they found in this clinical trial was that the outcomes were equivalent. Cancer recurrence outcomes were the same, regardless of whether men got the 5-session program or the 39-session program. That was great news for patients because it means that they can be treated in 5 sessions just as well with equivalent outcomes, and they don't need to come for 39 sessions. It's a huge win for patients and their quality of life. They can get the same effective treatment in fewer visits. So drilling down on their results a little bit, you can see the patients that got the SBRT, the 5-session program, are shown here in the yellow line, whereas patients that got the standard treatment are represented by the blue line. And you can see that at 5 years after treatment, the percentage of patients that failed treatment, that had a recurrence, was essentially identical between the two treatments. And it was very low. The number of patients that had a recurrence that failed treatment was less than 5% 5 years down the road. So this was a very reassuring, very exciting study that told us that you can treat localized prostate cancer just as well with 5 sessions, 5 high-dose sessions, as with 39 sessions. Of course, they also looked at side effects from the 5-session program compared to the 39-session program. And you can see that side effects were slightly higher in men that got the 5-session program. You can see an uptick of urinary side effects in particular. The percentage of patients reporting bothersome urinary side effects increased at about 13, 14 months after treatment. But reassuringly, in the long term, when we look 5 years out, the side effect rates were the same, whether or not patients got the 5 sessions or the 39 sessions. The long-term side effects were the same. So this is something that we learned from the clinical trial and that I discuss with patients who are considering radiation. There's multiple different treatment options, and this clinical trial helped us understand the benefits and trade-offs of each one. And then I know we're running short on time, so I'm actually going to skip this clinical trial. I'll briefly say that this was an intervention where they looked at early and aggressive palliative care interventions. So half of the patients got early palliative care referrals. Palliative care is where you're focusing more on patient comfort rather than treating the disease aggressively with curative intent. So focusing more on patient comfort earlier on in the pipeline versus later on in the pipeline. What they showed is that when you focus on patient comfort earlier on, you improve survival. So patients that got earlier palliative care interventions were on this red curve. And you can see at 30 months out after randomization, around 30% of patients were alive who got early referrals to palliative care doctors that were optimizing their comfort. Whereas at 30 months out in patients who did not get these early palliative care referrals, only about 10% of patients were alive. So clinical trials, as I mentioned earlier, can evaluate many different things. In this case, it was sort of a less is more approach, or focus on optimization of quality of life over quantity of life earlier on. And that intervention alone appeared to improve cancer outcomes for patients. So just finishing up here, what happens after a clinical trial has been conducted? Well, generally, the results of the clinical trial are presented to the scientific community and then published in a peer-reviewed academic journal. There's a lot of checks and balances to make sure that, what's being reported is true, is factual, is correct. And members of the scientific community and patients review this data to make sure that it is valid before it's published in an academic journal. And then at that point, additional analyses might be done using the clinical trial data, sometimes secondary analyses, sometimes additional clinical trials are done to clarify and confirm the effect of what was reported in other clinical trials. And then once there's sufficient data to support a new treatment intervention, a new drug, a new device, then a governmental agency, often the FDA, would need to review that data before determining whether or not it is approved for widespread use in the cancer community. The FDA is responsible not only for reviewing the data and determining if the intervention is effective, but also specifying the precise clinical context in which that drug is approved. Is it only approved for bladder cancer, or is it approved for all cancers? Is it approved for stage 2 disease only? Is it approved for stage 4 disease? All of those specifications factor into FDA approvals. And then lastly, once FDA approved, or even before FDA approval, the intervention might be incorporated into clinical guidelines, which are generated by panels of experts who meet regularly, review the literature, and identify new treatments that should wind up in the guidelines that clinicians use when determining which treatments to offer patients. Finishing up, how to access clinical trials. So the best place to start is with your treatment team. Talk to your primary treatment team. That might be a medical oncologist, in some cases a surgical oncologist or a radiation oncologist. Whoever is sort of the primary quarterback for your cancer care should be your first stop for discussing clinical trial options. They may be able to offer you a clinical trial at their institution, or if they don't have any clinical trials at their institution, they may be able to refer you to a colleague at a neighboring institution or an institution somewhere else that might have an open clinical trial that fits you in your unique clinical situation. If that's not very fruitful, sometimes different healthcare systems have clinical trial matching tools or search engines where you're able to enter details about your specific condition, the treatments you're interested in, and then it tells you whether or not a clinical trial is available for your unique situation. And then lastly, clinicaltrials.gov is a large national registry, international actually, registry of all clinical trials. And that's also a place you can search if you're willing to travel or able to travel to different states or even different countries to receive treatment. Clinicaltrials.gov can be a good resource for you. So this is an example of the first thing I mentioned, the institutional search tool. So this is UCLA's clinical trial search tool. You simply type in the disease that you're interested in, what study interventions, drugs, or radiation treatments or surgeries you're interested in, and then this tool can match you to clinical trials. And then this is a screenshot of what the clinicaltrials.gov website looks like. Very similar setup. You type in the condition you're interested in, other search terms like what treatments you are interested in receiving, and it can provide a list of clinical trials that are relevant for you and your situation. So I think that's all of the material I had. I wanted to pause and give folks who are on the call a chance to ask any questions they might have about clinical trials, about anything we discussed or anything new. We anticipate a dry spell in oncologic breakthroughs due to an absence of initial discoveries in the pipeline following cuts in federal cancer research grants, or have pharmaceutical companies invested in doing the type of research universities typically conduct? That is a great question, and you're absolutely right. There have been considerable cuts in federal funding for both the initial discoveries of agents that could ultimately wind up in clinical trials, as well as for clinical trials themselves. And the answer is complex. You're exactly right. Sometimes pharmaceutical companies have taken up the bar, and in recent years, provided more funding for clinical trials. That has limitations, as I was alluding to earlier, right? Clinical trial or pharmaceutical companies are incentivized to demonstrate that their product works well, and so you have to be a little bit careful and make sure that those safeguards are in place to sort of ensure that biases don't factor into the study results. But yes, there's been definitely more interest both on the side of clinical trial or pharmaceutical companies as well as device companies to fund these studies given lapses in federal funding. Universities and principal investigators such as myself are also interested in working with industry and working with people who are willing to fund clinical trials as opposed to potentially going through other, mechanisms like cooperative groups and things like that, where funding might be more limited. Physicians always confined to following treatment protocols that were standardized and approved through clinical trials, or do they have the latitude to adjust a treatment to a patient's biology? That's a really great question. So oftentimes the protocol builds in a little bit of flexibility. For example, if a patient's biology is disagreeing with a new study intervention, the protocol might say, okay, if X, Y, and Z side effects are happening, then the protocol mandates that you reduce the dose of the drug to half, for example, and then reevaluate the patient. If the patient no longer has side effects at that dose, then maybe the protocol might specify that you continue the treatment at just half the dose. In other cases, the clinical trial question itself is being asked in such a way to where the treatment is tailored to the patient's biology. So in that case, the protocol explicitly states that the regimen, the intervention, the treatment is going to be tailored to the unique patient's biology. An example of that is, we're looking at, say, for example, whether or not more aggressive prostate cancer tumors need hormone therapy, or whether hormone therapy can be omitted in some advanced prostate cancers. And so we're using patient-specific biomarkers, patient-specific molecular tests that inform us how aggressive the tumor is, and we use that to determine whether or not patients get hormone therapy or not. So yes, there's some latitude within a protocol to modify the treatment, but oftentimes it's usually latitude that's pre-specified in the protocol so that physicians aren't just sort of modifying the treatment and doing whatever they want in case the patient biology tells them that they're not responding to the treatment.
Thank you, Dr. Valle. We also received a question during registration, which is, I think, the same one that's in the chat. But someone is saying that they have prostate cancer that has spread to their bones, specifically their pelvis and rib. Do you know of any clinical trials for this specifically?
Yeah, there's many clinical trials available for prostate cancer that spread to the bones. The best way, I'll put my email, or you're more than welcome to share my email, and I can communicate with this person offline. But you can use the tools that we discussed at the end of the webinar, like clinicaltrials.gov, or pick a health system, an academic health system, and search their tool. But there's many exciting treatments that are coming out for prostate cancer that spread to the bones. There's very exciting combinations of radiation plus hormone therapy. There's exciting combinations of radiation plus radioligand therapy. Um, and there's also combinations of chemotherapy and specific targeted drugs that leverage weaknesses in prostate cancer tumors that can be helpful for individuals with metastatic prostate cancer. So the short answer to your question is yes, there's many clinical trials in this space. Um, for more specific guidance on what trials might be relevant for you specifically, I would bring it up to your healthcare team and see if they have any trials that they can recommend. There are many out there for your scenario.
Perfect. Thank you so much. We have reached the end of our time together, and I want to thank you once again, Dr. Valle, for being here with us, sharing all of your knowledge. We do have a brief closing slide that I will go ahead and share. So if you would like to learn more about Cancer Support Community Los Angeles, please visit our website at cancersupportla.org. And if you have any questions, please feel free to email us at info@cancersupportla.org. Dr. Valle has also graciously agreed to share a copy of his slides. So if you would like to request a copy, please feel free to email us. We would like to also let you know about one of our support groups that we offer. We actually offer quite a few general people living with cancer groups. We have one that meets on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Thursdays. And again, if you would like to get started, please feel free to scan that QR code. Or if you just have questions, please feel free to email us. I want to thank you all once again for joining us today. And we hope to see you at a future webinar workshop. Thank you so much, everyone.